Good to know. Okay. Check, check. There we go. How's everybody doing tonight? Excellent. Well, I want to welcome you to our... Get me down a little bit? Well, I'll turn it off once it's done. You good? All right. So I want to welcome you to our adult education class with Mladen
Yes.
Turk, who is the chair of religious studies at Elmhurst. Is it college or university?
University.
University, thank you. So Elmhurst University. And he's going to be talking to us about various religious traditions, particularly Eastern religious traditions. He's going to walk us through kind of their history, where they come from, and then we're going to get a little insight into some of their ceremonies and some of their rituals. And the reason why we're doing this, and you don't know this, but this is the reason why we asked you to come here, is that right now I'm doing a sermon series on the Apostles' Creed. And within that series, that is a ritual that we do within our church all the time. And so we wanted to have something parallel that we were doing, which would talk about rituals in other religions so that you all can have a sense of some of the things that they do that are important to them. So without further ado, I'm going to get out of the way. And would you invite Dr. Turk to the stage so he can speak? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pastor Alex. I'm so glad to be here with you tonight. Can you all hear me? Yes. Thank you. I do not mind being interrupted at any time, so if I say something that didn't make sense, feel free to let me know. So when I was asked to come over here, I do have a handout, so I will send it around. I hope we have enough copies. Not everything that I'll say is on it, and many things on it might not be what is of our immediate interest, but you might find it useful later on to go over some things. And many things in my talk might be things that you are well familiar with, but our plan for tonight is to introduce the series and to go over some preliminary kind of methodological issues. How is it that we can look at this? And you will see it's unusual. I don't know, I know you wouldn't be here unless you gave considerable thought to question, what is religion? What do we do when we are religious? And all those questions, kind of getting into them, are necessary for us to get into this question of rituals. What are religious rituals? Actually, talking about things that you might not know, and maybe you all know this, but when Mr. Tom Frigas? Krigas, sorry. When he asked me to come over, he also told me that many of my colleagues from other institutions declined. Yes, and I'll tell you why. And then I'll tell you a little bit about myself and so on. They declined not because they didn't want to come here. They would love to come here. But the way you asked for this topic to be covered is something that is usually not done. There are issues with it. And so what I proposed was to do it the other way around, to go and give some background and explain why is it so challenging? Why is it difficult to compare different religious traditions? And why is it difficult, if not impossible, to pull out certain elements from them and present them as something that is self-standing, like religious rituals? Does that make sense? So we're going to step back and kind of look at what do people like me do, people who do religious studies.
It's a little hard to hear.
Oh, sorry. I'll try to speak up or talk to my callers. So as you heard, my name is Mladen Turk. Actually, I'm originally Croatian. My last name sounds like I'm Turkish. I'm not Turkish, I'm Croatian. It is quite common last name in Croatia. And my first name is Slavic name, quite common in a few places besides Croatia. So in Serbia and Bulgaria, you would find that name. It actually means something. It literally means, so mlad in those languages and Slavic languages means young. So my name literally means young person. It used to fit, but so it is a translation. You know, there's a Latin name, Juventius or Juventius or Juvencius or whatever. It's a common name. I guess Giovanni in Italian would be the equivalent. So my area of studies, basically what I do, I'm a generalist. I do several different things. As Pastor said, I'm a professor and chair of religious studies at Elmhurst University. And you're right, we recently changed from being a college that we were for quite some time. Actually, last year we celebrated our 150th anniversary. So I'm plugging it in now. If you have your children, your grandchildren or great-grandchildren, you know, it's a wonderful place to study. And what we do is, and that's what I do there, is this is something we say often, we do professional preparation with liberal education. And so religious studies fits within what we call liberal education. Liberal, as you know, means basically being broad, meaning general purpose education for things that we cannot foresee. So, and that's why I would like to commend you for choosing this series, for being interested in those matters, because I think that's what what I do on a daily basis. I think knowing about various religious traditions is part of what does it mean to be cultured in any culture. So what I'm going to say tonight, and especially in my future lectures, will be both something that affects all of us directly, and especially you, given that you attend your church, you all have your religious identity. But regardless of any religious identity, thinking about what does it mean to be religious and understanding other ways of being religious is what I think any educated person, anyone who lives in our global interconnected world, is kind of we are all responsible to learn something about it, right? So, as I said about my background, I studied philosophy, ethnology, which would be like cultural anthropology, and Indology. Indology is a subject, so from India, Indology. It's actually fairly old field of studies coming from 19th century, originated in Germany, and it focuses on Indian languages and cultures. During my studies, I also studied Chinese, so ancient Indian languages, Chinese language, so this is where I have basic knowledge of those things. I'm not translating from those languages, but I learned that because I thought these are my necessary tools to begin to understand what religious behaviors are about. I also have a degree in theology. I studied theology, so it's kind of, that's what makes me a generalist that I am. Yes?
Did I hear you? Excuse me. Did I hear you say that the Indian language was the precursor to that was Chinese?
No, what I said was I studied Indology. And Indology is a discipline, academic discipline that studies ancient Indian languages and cultures.
India, as in Indian as in India?
Yes. So Indian as in India. So languages that I studied are Sanskrit, which is ancient Indian language, which is often in Europe in some older universities studied at departments of classical philology, so together with Greek and Latin typically. It is considered to be one of those classical languages, so that's what I studied.
Do you speak Chinese too?
No, I don't speak it, but I studied it, so a little bit. Just a little bit about that background. But and I've been at Elmhurst University, that used to be college. This is actually my 19th year that I've been teaching there, so it's not. And what I teach is world religions. I also teach other courses, including religion and science, religious classics, religions of India, and I often take students actually practically every year on study trips to India. So that's my main focus. So I call that religions of South Asia. So South Asia typically means, everything on the Indian subcontinent. So why does, well, this picture here illustrates, something that I was about to say about rituals. This particular temple is in Khajuraho in India, and at first you might think when you see, and this is what makes it so complex, so difficult to understand other traditions without going into their history. This is what makes it so complex, so difficult to understand rituals without going back into what religious traditions are about. So here you see this temple is actually called Mount Kailash Temple. Mount Kailash is considered, even though there is actual mountain in Himalayan mountain. I don't know, did any of you ever travel there? I've been to some of those places. I'm not from there, but I find them fascinating. So Himalayan mountains are just really unbelievable when you see them. I wasn't climbing those high peaks, but I saw mountain ranges and traveled through that part of the world. And when you see those mountains, they are just unbelievable. I mean, I don't know, did you ever experience other mountains? I've seen the Alps in Europe. They are also unbelievable, but nothing compares. I'm sure from just general culture that for example, 100 tallest mountains in the world are all there. So basically, no other mountain range comes anywhere close. So in most Indian religions, those mountains play a major role. And you wouldn't be necessarily able, and this particular temple is far away from those mountains. Really, it is in a region where there are no mountains. It's in the middle of India.
In the middle?
Yes. So, but that is what it represents. It's a mountain. It's Mount Kailash, and Mount Kailash is where God Shiva, who is one of the main gods of Hinduism, lives. So that's how you would know what it is. So you see, taking things out of context would actually make them hard to understand. So even though in some sense it looks like a church, and maybe some churches used to be built in that way to represent certain part of the world, but this is supposed to be almost like a map of the world. On every corner, it has gods that have to do with that part of the world. There are gods of domestic images on the temple, on the outside. For example, gods of your kitchen, gods of your every part of your household, but then also basically levels of reality, lower level, mid-level where people live, and then higher level where divine beings live. Everything is represented there. And I'm saying this because religious traditions are often about how do we understand, in what way do we as human beings relate to the order of the world. And the order of the world is often understood to be invisible, something you cannot perceive directly. So entering a temple like this, or circumambulating the temple, walking around it. By the way, this is what one is supposed to do. That's how you learn about those things when you approach it. So talking about rituals, here is how one of those rituals goes. So entrance is on the right side. It's behind the title here. You cannot see it well. I didn't plan to use this slide in this way, but going in basically clockwise motion around the temple would be expected, and then going in, and then inside, there are 3 chambers, and the last chamber is where the image of the divine is. This particular God has many forms, and the form in which that God is depicted at the end of the temple, the idol in the temple, if you like, is actually not a human form at all. It is actually a completely kind of abstract, amorphous form. It's a black stone that kind of looks, like a column, nothing else. And it is kind of depicting this kind of, it is interesting because symbols are always kind of interconnected. So that stone is typically black, even though it stands for the light. So it's supposed to be, about the power of light, even though the last chamber of the temple is dark and the image is dark, it's very hard to see. So understanding all those things, we have to kind of step back and begin to think about what do we do when we approach a place like that. So can we have a next slide, please? Thank you. So 4 hours a week, so this is long. You can imagine. I mean, somebody asked me, what do my students do? I don't know. Who was it? Like, you know, nowadays, most of them just go on their smartphone and look everything up. But one thing that I'm very proud of is that by the end of my classes, my students sometimes ask me, so what is your religion? And I consider that to be great success, which means I really go at great length not to take any particular point of view, which is quite rare, you know. So why do we do that? Why is that important? So what I do is non-religious study of religion. So I kind of postpone, I bracket, I leave home my own views, because if I would get involved, and this is very typical, this is not, I'm saying I'm doing this and so on, but it is really typical of the field of academic studies that I do. Everyone does that. So everyone in my department would say, including people who teach the Bible, for example, they would say that they do not teach religion, that they teach about religion. Does that make sense, that distinction? And you see, actually, that distinction in some other context would not make any sense. If your math teacher comes in and says, I teach about mathematics, but I don't teach mathematics, you would say, what difference? I mean, what are you talking about? I don't get the difference, right? You see the point? Well, with religion, we see that. That does not entail any value judgment. Values are things like good and bad, good and evil, those sorts of ethics, when those things come in. So I'm not saying, the point is that without looking at religious behaviors from the outside, there would be things about them that we would miss. And what I mean when I say there's no value judgment in this, I mean that there is no problem in being religious. And many people who say that they teach about religion are also religious. They just put that aside for a moment when they talk about religion in this academic way. So this is very important for us. So this is very different. You don't get, so for example, of course, what would be the other way? Anything that would be done in any religious seminary, for example, would be different. That's where you get, or in your church. So, in a way, that's why I'm saying I'm commending you for going after general education here and learning about other religious traditions. And of course, more sure we are in our own understanding of our own tradition, more open, less afraid we have to be about anything else we learn. Those things are not in competition. So you learning about other religious traditions does not mean anything in terms of you giving up on your own tradition. So nothing that I will say about other religious traditions here must be, nothing has to be internalized in order to be understood. So that's the point here. Why do we do that? First of all, this field is relatively new. It grew out of the European Enlightenment. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept. It's an intellectual movement that began in 18th century, basically. It transformed the way people in the Western world understand themselves, their relation to everything else. So main characteristics of modernity are all associated with that movement. In this country, we are all familiar with some products of that movement because very important. So for example, all of our founding fathers of this country were in one way or another involved with that movement. They were the acolytes, they were the disciples of main figures of the Enlightenment. So you can hear, things you hear in writings of someone like Thomas Jefferson or someone like Benjamin Franklin are very similar to what you hear in writings, including in those main documents. You know, if you look at the Constitution, among other things, you will see definitions there that sound curiously like what you can read in John Locke or some other philosophers who were main figures of the Enlightenment. And the European Enlightenment, that intellectual movement, occurred in a peculiar time in European history, or world history in that sense, in which there were still religious wars in Europe. If you remember your intro to Western civilization or something like that, if you studied Western civilization, you know those things. And those religious wars in Europe were primarily between Catholics and Protestants, right? Many people who were involved in attempts to resolve those conflicts, people who were sick and tired of those things, people who were involved in practical things like politics, diplomacy, but also people who were involved in religious matters. At first, they might have thought that this whole conflict could be resolved through some sort of theological breakthrough. You know, theologians will get together, figure out how to understand what they are saying, so basically bring all Christians together into one understanding of Christianity. Every attempt like that failed. You know, historians go through this. So we don't know. At the end, when you look back at those events, religion was often, Christianity in this particular instance, used as an excuse for, typical things that are done through wars, basically taking somebody else's land or something like that. So most historians do not believe that those wars were religious because they were fought over religious matters. But we know from history that religion was used to justify those divisions. So that particular distinction made many people to begin to reconsider how to think religiously and how to think about tolerance. That's why I mentioned people like, for example, John Locke, English philosopher, who was famous for writing on tolerance and this was back then completely revolutionary. It is fine for people to live in one country even though they belong to different, in their case it was really just different versions of Christianity. That movement later on became unstoppable, and everything else, including the beginnings of modern science and so on, grew out of that movement. That same movement produced the idea that religious traditions can be understood in a non-religious way. So many other academic disciplines have their origins in that way of thinking. So that's what I'm talking about. That's the kind of academic background that I come from. Like I said, I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. So one does not have to cease to be religious to do that. But it is also true that for many people that question the basis of their religious behaviors, of their religious faith. This is adult education, so these are serious questions. So yes, I will bring, especially tonight. In the future, it will be, other talks will be way more about different religious traditions and specifics on them, including rituals. But tonight, I'm going to go over some relatively difficult questions for us to ask. So what do we do when we are religious? What does religion do? What does religious faith do for you? That sort of question. And again, I'm approaching this from a non-religious point of view. Non-religious is different than anti-religious or anything like that. I wouldn't study religious traditions if I would be anti-anything, right? I think it matters so much. That's why I'm so deeply interested in it. So at the beginning of this field, so when people began to think about other religious traditions, what they did was they looked at everything through the lens of what they knew. It's to be expected. We usually learn by going from what we know to what we don't know, right? So people began with Christianity. So they would compare every other religious tradition to Christianity. And this is what eventually caused problems. This is one of the main reasons why, for example, when maybe, I don't know, I cannot read anyone's mind, but maybe when Mr. Krieges asked those other people would they want to talk about many different religious rituals, they said, no, we cannot do that, right? Because that would somehow entail that rituals can be compared across many different traditions, just like one-to-one. Okay, so let's say, for example, in Christianity, there is baptism, so what is like baptism in another tradition, right? That type of comparison does not work. That would be somewhat equivalent to, let's say, history or something like that. If you would say that one country, its history, one nation, one group, whatever, history of one region actually can be better understood if it is looked through the lens of another region. The history of your village would be much better if it would be more like history of my village, that sort of thing. People just look and say, that's impossible. That just doesn't work like that. We see this intrinsic uniqueness of all those ways of experiencing the world that cannot be conflated, cannot be all put into one group. And also, we cannot create one-to-one relationships between them. It's kind of like, I don't know what would I compare that with, but you know how, as I was driving here, I used, as everyone does these days, Google Maps and those kinds of things. So we know that Google can do, you can put a street map or satellite map, right? And if you have, and by the way, obviously, both are really good for very different things. Actually, when you're driving around, satellite map is not that good. Because streets look too narrow, trees occlude where crossings are. I don't want to know what a satellite map looks like. I want to know, where do I turn left? What is next, right? So does that make sense? So, but those two maps can be overlaid one on top of the other, and clear relationship can be drawn from them. If you look at another kind of map, like for example, if you live in Chicago, anywhere, or if you use almost any other kind of, any kind of public transport, those maps on L trains that show L train? They don't look like street maps. They don't look like, actually in most L trains you see straight line. And this is across the world. Everyone uses them. You remember? Why? You're not driving the train. You don't care where it turns. All you have to know is how many stops until my stop, right? Perfect map for when you're on the train, horrible map if you drive, right? But you see, relating those maps, yes, they can be related one-to-one, but not in a simple way by overlaying them. Does that make sense? So comparisons get very different depending on what are we comparing. So you cannot put that L map over your satellite map or over your street map. You would have to keep it far away and then maybe draw lines or something. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep things far apart and try and draw lines and see if we can somehow find connections here. If you like that, don't take that literally. And by the way, of course, maps, which is so interesting. This is another thing that I hope, it's not too late for you to think hard about those things. But maps, you cannot walk on a map. I mean, nowadays, because it's all electronic, it's different. But I'm sure all of you remember those maps we used to have in cars when you are folded and so on. Map is not a territory. You can walk on your map, but you are going to go nowhere, right? So if you have a map of Chicagoland, you cannot walk on a map and get to where you want to be. So those two things are not to be confused. And by the way, I mean, I know that this seems quite obvious to everyone, but you will be surprised how often that happens. People look at texts, narratives, people look at architecture, material culture, people look at behaviors, and they often confuse maps. And I told you that previous slide had that temple, that temple is map of the world with basically sanctum sanctorum. This is garbhagriha in Indian temples. Holy of the Holies is under that highest peak there, and that highest peak is actually peak of one of those peaks of those Himalayan mountains. And understanding that kind of puts you in place, and you know where are you going, you know what to expect there. By the way, that mountain, God who lives on that mountain in that particular version of Hinduism, as I said earlier, is Shiva, and the great river Ganges, that is, I'm sure you all heard of it, a very important river in India in so many ways, and also religiously, actually comes from his hair. So it is also from, it literally doesn't. So if you look geographically, River Ganges does not come from that river, from that mountain, but the mountain on which he's believed to live is considered to be a source of the Ganges River. And on many images, I will show you later on, maybe next time, some images of Shiva where you can see that River Ganges actually flows from his hair. Oh, really? That's fantastic. Which river? Yeah, this is good. So my point here was that Christianity was often used as a model for other religious traditions, and people found issues with that. That's my example with maps was they simply could not overlay other religious traditions onto Christianity. So if you go around and ask people, okay, so we have our God, what is your God? That at first sounds, why not? That makes sense, common sense, doesn't it? Well, actually, we know historically, and these are not my mere opinions, these are basically things people established through literature, historians pointed that out. Whenever that happened, in this kind of intercultural exchange, both cultures got transformed. So famous examples are when conquistadors came to the Americas, they asked people who were around, like Aztecs, for example, today in Mexico, they asked them, who is your king? And of course, the idea of what kings are and are not wasn't theirs, really. Their rulers were not like kings of Europe of that time. So just that, and then of course, eventually everything evened out. Both cultures got transformed. So Aztecs eventually said, yeah, he is, But the point is that first moment, there was no idea of what does it mean to be a king that was equivalent between two different civilizations. Does that make sense? By the way, we know that because those Spanish conquistadors, they wrote extensive chronicles, and they had, theologians with them and so on. So for example, those theologians, they wrote down their own account of what do Aztec monks do. They call them the religious. Who are your religious? Religious meaning religious, like monks and nuns and priests and so on. So same thing. There was no such concept. So at first you might be puzzled, like why does that matter? But you see what is going on. It's my earlier example when I said the history of your village would make more sense if it would be more like history of my village. And we all, I hope, agreed that that approach makes no sense. Your life is your life. So there is uniqueness that comes with each civilization, and of course religious traditions embedded in them. By the way, some religious traditions and some ideas within religious traditions do spread through diffusion. They really learn one from the other. In those cases, yes, then certain comparisons can be made. We know that famously, of course. I know for sure that you're all familiar in one way or another with the fact that Christianity grew out of Judaism, right? It is its own thing, but of course, Jesus, all of Jesus' disciples, place where they were, things they did were all Jewish things, right? So basically, in that sense, they are related, right? But we also know that Christian scriptures were written in Greek, not in Hebrew, and that they were also, in some cases, especially in case of Apostle Paul, really geared towards people who were not Jewish, even though Paul obviously was, and like I said, everyone really around Jesus, they were in that part of the world, they spoke those languages, that's where they belonged. But they also taught in other terms. So in this case, yes, obviously there are comparisons, but possibility of comparing things does not mean identity. So still, there is no clear continuity. Otherwise, we would fall into some kind of, supersessionism or something like that. That obviously does not do justice to those traditions that are then understood to be superseded. So that is what people in my field really struggle with. How do we study those things? And we study them because we think they are of utmost importance for our understanding of what does it mean to be human, what does it mean in different ways, how do we relate to one another, and what answers did people throughout history give to a set of questions that we still grapple with today. I'll actually list those questions. They're also listed on your handout. I do have one point. This is so hard to read for you, I'm sure. If you can read, you know that joke. It says up there, it says, if you can read this, you don't need glasses, right? I'm joking because, of course, I need. But we call that distinction, and the insider and outsider distinction. That's what one of those points says there. So what difference is there if I approach something as an insider or as an outsider? Well, there are so many ways to illustrate that, but simplest ones are things we know immediately. When I say that something is immediate, this immediate literally means there is no mediation. Mediation means nothing in between. So if you have, I hope this is not true, God forbid, if you have a headache, for example, if you have a headache, your knowledge of your headache is immediate. Nobody can tell you you don't have it. You don't need any proof. Even if somebody comes in and tells you, no, you don't have it, it makes no difference, right? And this kind of knowledge is understood to be immediate. Other things are like that, some properly basic things. Being conscious, those of you who are conscious now in this moment, I guess everyone could smile, if you didn't fall asleep. But the thing is that things we know immediately would be kinds of things that we are insiders to, right? So we have this kind of insider knowledge of those things. Other things we know through some kind of mediation. It's kind of like examples like riding a bicycle or something. And so approaching those two, so if you know how to ride a bicycle, it's hard to explain unless somebody tries it. It is impossible to learn just by listening about it. You have to do it, right? And usually for most people, if you learn it once, everything else being the same, save for some, special thing. Yes?
I just have a quick question. Given that most people, I was just looking at your sheet, given that most people in here are Christian by background.
Yeah.
Given what you're going to be discussing of Eastern traditions, could you talk a little bit about just maybe some of the ways of thinking that we've adopted as Westerners that when you start to kind of get into some of the Eastern traditions that will be kind of that you see, I'm sure you deal with this in your classes because you're dealing with mostly Westerners, but that there's places where we don't really, our way of thinking tends to divert from their way of thinking to kind of set the stage for what you'll be talking about with some of those churches?
Right, that's a good point. I think I definitely will. Thank you for bringing that up. And what I'm talking about now, I think, is actually part of that, right? Because if we begin by, or if we say, oh, this is how we think, how do you think about that? We are already going beyond what I think can be done unless we go and learn about that tradition from its own context. So I don't know if that makes sense, but typically those,
Well, like in Western thinking,
Yes.
there's oftentimes duality. Like you talked about good and bad, right?
right,
Like we have in our Western thinking, it's just there's right and there's wrong. In Eastern thinking, there's usually a tension, understanding there is no such thing as absolute good and absolute bad.
right.
But there's like that you're living in the tension of those two things. And I think that can be very hard for Western people to understand
Yeah.
because we live in that kind of bipolarity. You know what I'm saying? So I was just wondering, that's the thing that I'm asking about is like where as you're going to be talking about these things, I feel like there's going to be places where we're going to struggle. Like I see it all the time.
Yeah. Thank you. You see, a few years ago, Oxford University in England, great place, obviously, their main professor of history of Christianity wrote a book. He's an expert on just some things, but he wrote this giant, I don't know, almost 1,000 pages, but it is one volume. I would strongly recommend it. History of Christianity, right? So it is called, his name is Dermot McCullough, and the book is called, I think it's called Christianity First 3,000 Years, he said. So it's 3,000. He didn't want to start 2,000 because he looks at everything where Christianity came to be. So in that book, and this is quite common, he does not use singular for Christianity. So he's not saying Christianity, he's saying Christianities in plural. So why? Well, almost anything one wants, if I would begin my sentence by saying, and you know that, I'm sure, if I begin my sentence by saying all Christians believe, I mean, I can find a counterexample to anything you say, unless you say something so general that it becomes irrelevant, kind of like human beings or something, you know. So does that make sense? Even then, people would say, no, wait a minute, St. Francis preached to animals, or, you know, stuff like that, you know. It is very hard to universalize things, even within various religious traditions, let alone to lump them together into Western or Eastern. So, for example, in India, of course, there are, first of all, name Hinduism is only from 17th century, even though religious tradition itself goes as far back as we can tell. It is so diverse that it is mind-boggling. How in the world do we think we can put this together? And yes, there are very dualistic ways of being Hindu. Actually, most devotional versions of Hinduism are very dualistic, and they see gods as different things and human beings as different things. There are also very philosophical and very experiential versions of Hinduism that are exactly as you hinted, very monistic in their understanding. But then you look at Western Christianity, you find mystical schools that are as monistic as those schools. And so, you know, this is what makes it so hard. And that's my example with maps was supposed to illustrate that. So I'm not saying skeptical, but I would approach this with enormous amount of, as much as I could muster, humility, you know, before I would lump anything together. So I'm kind of breaking things apart, not because, you know, of any other reason apart from I don't see any way, and this is not just me, I think there's wide agreement in this field. It is very difficult to lump things together. Like I said, even if you want to talk about just one religious tradition. Arguably, this is true of any religious tradition. So if you look at Judaism, is it one or is it many? In many cases, it ends up being, again, this plural, you know, so Judaisms or, you know, Islams. Especially many religious traditions, as you know, do not have any major kind of hierarchical structure, worldwide authority, none of this. So they are even expected to be very diverse within themselves. That's why it is so difficult to lump them together. I know it takes time to get into this, but I hear your question. I'll definitely come back to that. The only thing on this slide that I would like to point is empathy. People sometimes call that sympathetic imagination. You know, empathy and sympathy are slightly different things, but in literature, sympathetic imagination is when you kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes in order to understand them. Understanding does not mean approval, does not mean that you're internalizing their own view. You're not becoming Hindu if you think about Hinduism. But it is next to impossible to begin to understand something as an outsider unless you have at least a dose of empathy. Does that make sense? So this is kind of like in literature, literary scholars call that suspension of disbelief, right? You all, I'm sure, when you go to see a play in a theater, actors are here, you know, I'm on a stage kind of here. In those Greek theaters, there was this special arch, prosimian arch, that separates the public. It is a ritual, so, by the way, ancient Greek theater was religious. So everything that happens on this side of the stage is make-believe. And the audience is required to suspend their disbelief. You know, children sometimes do not do that. Now, you know, when something happens on a stage, children can maybe, oh no, don't go there, you know. We do that maybe when we watch, if you watch a scary movie, you know, and somebody says, let's split and I'll go to the basement, and you sit at home and you say, don't go to the basement and don't split, right? So that's the moment when we go beyond, we kind of feel like we are in it, right? But make-believe, where you know that this is suspension of disbelief. It is easy to disbelieve because you know that theatrical plays are not really happening. You know, if something terrible, if you watch Shakespeare, somebody dies, you know they didn't die. It's an actor here, right? And so you suspend your disbelief, and in order to experience the play, you think, yes, they died, you know? So does that make sense? So same kind of attitude, I think, is beneficial if we go and study. Because otherwise, every worldview that is not our own actually can be easy to, you know, people just, how can anyone believe that? It sounds preposterous. Almost anything that comes from a worldview that we were not acculturated in might seem to us just simply wrong way of doing things, right? So that's where empathy and this kind of sympathetic imagination, suspension of disbelief is helpful. I'm not saying required, because in some cases, you know, why would you be required to put yourself in everyone's shoes? But it is, you know, and sometimes we can't, you know. There are religious traditions that have practices that are downright atrocious. You know, you don't want to, you know, necessarily think like, I don't know how you think about animal sacrifice or something like that. But, you know, those things also exist in religious traditions that we are well familiar with, like Judaism, for example. So, but in many cases, you know, there are moments where we also kind of stop, right? And when we say, okay, that's enough for me. So that's fine too, but I'm saying a dose of that kind of empathy is helpful. Otherwise, we would forever stay so far that we wouldn't be able to understand it. Can you please move to the next slide? So, doesn't that look curious, like their child was born in a cave there? That's that Mount Kailash where they live. That's their abode. Shiva is also god of yoga. So you can see he's covered in tiger hide, basically, typically, or in this case, it looks more like leopard. But, and then there are acolytes down there, mystics, ascetics on the right side, and kings, princes on the left side. They all came to worship him. They all came to pay their homage, ask, propitiate his favor. There are other fantastic creatures, basically tiger on one side. By the way, that bull is typically, you know, any Shaivite temple, including the one that I showed you before. When you come close to any of those temples, you will see big image of a bull. That's Nandi, his bull on which he rides around the world. And basically, wherever that bull looks, you know, sometimes you're not sure, where am I supposed to go here? Kind of like when I was on your parking lot, I looked, where should I enter, right? If you go to one of those Hindu temples talking about kind of ritual understanding of space, if you see the bull, and you see where the bull is looking, that's where you're supposed to go, because that's where Shiva image is typically, yes. On the left. It's hard to see. You see on the left, kind of head of a bull is sticking out. Yes. Few points here, and I know we are kind of low on time. I've been slow in introducing this topic, but I'll go over several things now. So what is religion? I mean, what is it? What do you do when you're religious? That is one of those questions that came out of the Enlightenment. People tried to define it. And by the way, that question originated in the European Enlightenment. Strangely enough, throughout history, in the Western world or practically anywhere else, and today, really, it is a Western, your question. So here is, Pastor. So what is religion does not exist as a question in really almost any other civilization except in Western civilization. It ended up, through the contingencies of history, that in Western civilization we split religious behaviors from other behaviors. Not throughout all of Western history, but in the Enlightenment. That is where religion became our own private thing. And we had, you remember I mentioned how our founding fathers of this country believed in the Enlightenment view. That is reflected in their view of religion. So religion ended up being our private thing, as opposed to things we do publicly, where religion has different role. So what is religion became a question only after religion was removed from everything else that we do as human beings. So what did people think about religion before? Well, it was part and parcel of everything else we do. Kind of like together with customs, together with everything else, whole culture. There was no separation anywhere in their understanding of how societies function and religion. So that's why that question, questions like, what is your religion, already imply that religion is separate from who you are and what you do. Does that make sense? Yes.
Well, I have a question. Is Shiva a god or a prophet or a teacher?
Very good question. So I hope to talk about that next time. So yes, so that question, well, it depends what do we mean by a god. So, I guess in Sanskrit there's another word, deva, and that word means gods. Basically, we usually translate it as God, but Hinduism is so diverse, so it really does depend whom do you ask. So for example, there are at least 3 main branches of Hinduism, and in one of those branches, Shiva is seen as a supreme reality, everything. So Shiva is God in that absolute sense of kind of ground of being type. Actually, any movement, any power in the universe is Shiva moving around. So wherever you see life, wherever you see power, it's actually Shiva. That's how far it goes. On the other hand, in some versions of Hinduism, he's more like some kind of angel or something like that. You're some kind of intermediary being. And there are stories in various traditions that depict him one way or the other. In some cases, actually, the oldest writings that we have, even though as God, he's probably very ancient as anything we can find, but by name, he's not mentioned in the oldest writings. And that's where other kinds of ways of thinking originate. There is another name that is mentioned in some of those writings, Rudra, and then people who like to harmonize things, they say, well, Rudra really means Shiva, even though words are not the same, and so on. So yeah, it depends whom do you ask. It is not as simple. So for Shaiva tradition, Shiva, which would be one branch of Hinduism, Shiva is the supreme god, but then even within Shaivism, there is disagreement as to how far does that go. Is it monistic? Like there is only one reality and it is really Shiva, and even all of us are Shiva, that sort of monism? Or is it dualism in a sense in which Shiva is a god that we worship? Both of those versions exist. So it's a good question. So I wish it would be simple, but those things are difficult to get in. So that's why I'm commending you to be even interested in this. But it is worth it. It's worth it, and this kind of preliminary stuff will help you be clear about some stuff later on. So essential view of religion. This is something that comes very natural to many people. Is essentialist view says that religion is one and the same thing. There's like common core to all religious traditions. Everywhere you go, people have something they call religion, and that common core is always the same. This is essentialism, right? This is where religious studies kind of diverge from common sense, I should say. We do not see it that way. Why? Well, because, like I said earlier, this would mean that we use one tradition in order to determine what is going on in every other tradition. Historically, that happened with Christianity. By the way, it is interesting. Christians did traditionally understand, in the time of Protestant Reformation. I'm sure you heard those stories If you didn't, you can look it up. For example, at one point, Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, he commented on the Pope. He obviously had issues with the Pope. This is not me saying, so don't take that against me, or in any way, but he said that the Pope actually is worse than the Sultan in Istanbul. Did you ever hear that Luther said that? This was supposed to be an insult to the Pope, right? And the Sultan in Istanbul heard that and said, why don't you come here and tell me more about that? I'm interested. And then Luther wrote, he didn't go. But when he wrote about why he wouldn't go, and obviously he didn't mean that in the sense that, his point was that he defined Islam, Luther did, Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, as a heresy within Christianity. By the way, they didn't even use the word Islam. They said that's like Mahometan heresy. And they had a list of other heresies. It went together with those ancient heresies from first few centuries of Christianity. Does that make sense? That is exactly what does it mean to look at other religious traditions through the lens of your own. So everything Luther knew about Islam told him that Islam is basically a version of Christianity that is wrong. They just got it wrong, right? So that is when you compare things one to one. Of course, this is a very flagrant kind of case, I don't think everyone. So typically when people talk about what is this essential, I know it's kind of late, I don't know if, do you think it would be possible for me to have like a few more minutes? Do you have patience for just a few more minutes so that I can go? Is that okay?
You can go, some of us have to go get our kids from the other program.
Sure, sorry about that, I've been really slow. But I just want to go over some things that I think you will find helpful later on. So what is that common core? What do people identify as the essence of religion? Well, here you have some examples. Faith, belief, the sacred, the holy. So typically when you hear someone talk about the holy, how do you relate to something that you consider to be the holy? And by the way, many of those things are often interchangeable. The sacred, things that are set apart and so on. That is what is being worshipped in every religion. Those views are essentialist views. Another way to look at religion is to ask, what does religion do? That would be functionalism here, right? What does religion do? And then there are other definitions. I'm not going to go, because of time, I'm not going to go into this family resemblance definition. Can you please have next slide? He understood religion to be what we do as a community. There is no way for you to be religious on your own. It's only what you do with other people. That's his understanding. Then we have, of course, American psychologist William James. He says religion is the the opposite. You have a sociologist here saying religion is what we do as a society. You have psychologists saying it is your innermost sense of how do I relate my life to the invisible order of the world, to relate my life to the divine. You see, in religious studies, we take both of this, both sociology of religion and psychology of religion very seriously, but you see that they do not necessarily come together easily. And then we have a religious kind of definition. This is Paul Tillich, who was what concerns you ultimately. Ultimate, absolute, unconditional, all of them mean same thing. Basically, all of them mean something that you do not put any conditions on, right? What everything else depends on, and nothing, and your faith depends on nothing else, right? So if you say to someone, I love you, but you're putting conditions on your love, right? Loving unconditionally would be without that but, without saying, you know, something else about it. So Tillich taught whatever in your life you are concerned with, ultimately, that is your religion. As you can see, these are very different ways of looking at things. I have some, can you move to 2 slides? Actually, let's skip this. Seems to be, and people understood it that way for quite some time, something we can find in almost any religious tradition. So even when we disagree, we can look at other religious traditions as a repository of people's answers to that question. I don't know if you ever wondered about this, but what is all this? You know, that's where answers like, well, it's God's creation, you know, or something like that come in, right? But that question, what is all this? By the way, today, many people, including many religious people, many Christians, answer that question not necessarily by looking at resources from their religious tradition. People begin to talk about scientific knowledge, for example. You know, this first question especially is the one that people often, so they start talking about the Big Bang, you know, other things. That's fine. But it is really going after this, what is all this? What is everything? What is it? So, famous philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, he asked that question, why there is something rather than nothing, right? Why there is the world, right? So that is, whatever your answer to that question is, that is what religious traditions are made of. Second question, and this is very important. What am I supposed to do with my life? Sit on my couch, watch TV? I mean, why bother? Why do anything? You all have answers to those questions, right? You wouldn't be here. But whatever we do, most people do have answers to those questions. That question is one where you can find every religious tradition grappling with this question. What am I supposed to do with my life? And then a third one, and that one is where does it lead? You can ask that question in another way. Actually, famous 19th century or 18th, early 19th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, he asked it, is there anything I can hope for? What am I hoping for? Those 3 questions I'm going to use to go through various religious traditions and to explain some religious rituals, to show you examples of practices from different religious traditions, always going back to how they deal with those 3 questions. Does that make sense? I had a bunch of other slides that some I skipped and some I still have, but I'll drop it now. Maybe I'll come back to this next time. So any questions right now? I'm so sorry I went over time. But thank you for your patience, and I hope to see you here next time. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.